Hello and welcome to the Triploy podcast. I am Triploy, as you may have guessed, and today we're doing episode 2, which I have titled Why Afghanistan is the Graveyard of Empires. It's actually a topic I've been meaning to cover for a while in both videos and the podcast, so I'm just really in the mood to talk about this story now. So that's what we're going to do today. I find Afghanistan particularly interesting because although it has dominated the headlines in the West for pretty much the entirety of this century so far, we in the West don't really know anything about the place. We only know what we have been told by corporate media and, of course, the governments. They've been waging war in Afghanistan. Of course, we're out of there now. But, we spent a better part of 2 decades doing it, and, none of us really know why. So that's something I really want to talk about today, more the colonial history of Afghanistan and what brought us to this point and what lays in the future for Afghanistan. And because it's very interesting that Afghanistan has been an imperial target for all sorts of countries for centuries. But I guess the question is why? It is it's one of the most inaccessible countries on Earth. It is landlocked in Central Asia. It's at the foot of the Himalaya mountain range. Not accessible at all. Most empires can't even get to Afghanistan, let alone invade it, yet empires keep trying. Why? So today we're going to look at 3 invasions over the past about 150 odd years and look at why they failed, why they happened, and the lessons we might learn from them. So for the purposes of our story, it's going to start in about 1839, which is when the British will first invade it. So what is pre-colonial Afghanistan like? It's a very interesting place. It's basically a tribal confederation. It does have like an overarching government, but it is effectively run by the various tribes in Afghanistan. The biggest of them is the Pashtun tribe. They run what is basically a loose monarchy of the area, and it's still pretty much feudal society. And although I don't pretend to be an expert by any means about Afghan tribal society, I have been learning a little bit about the Pashtun in particular, and especially a cultural attribute they have, which is really important to this entire story. It's called Pashtunwali, and it is this is the Triploy version of this, by the way, so if you're Afghan, you're listening to this and I got it all wrong, I'm very sorry. This is what I've learned so far, right? But to me, it looks a lot like the warrior spirit you see in a lot of other, incidentally, feudal societies. It kind of reminds me of the samurai in Japan. It reminds me of the knights in Europe. But it's basically this idea that there's this caste that runs by a really important cultural code. And the specifics of that code historically, they change, and there are all sorts of different things. And they are here, like the Pashtunwali is very, very different to like Bushido. But what they share in common is that it is definitely a driving force in the life and culture of this land, and it is something that is pretty much unbreakable, and that is going to be super important to Afghans going forward, and one of the big reasons why this place is so unconquerable. And the things that Pashtunwali really revere, they've got a very strong hospitality belief, like you're meant to welcome guests and look after guests and protect guests. But there's also a level of respect that is expected of guests and expected of anyone who interacts with you, even to the point that if this is betrayed in whatever way, you are expected, possibly even demanded, to seek revenge for it. And that kind of taps into it a bit, but this is a lot deeper than that. And this extends all the way to, say, foreign invaders coming into your country uninvited and what you're going to do to them if they do. But we'll come back to the Pashtunwali in a little bit. First of all, let's look at why is Afghanistan even a target at all? Well, there's of course the usual reasons for colonialism, which is you want to snap up the land to steal all of the resources and control all of the trade. In the instance of Afghanistan, it's a big agrarian economy. One of the side products being grown there, which will play a big part in other stories, is opium. It is one of the biggest opium producing areas in the entire world. And at the same time this story is about to start, around 1839, The British are already setting up a lot of opium fields in India, which of course they already have colonized, and they're using the opium to send it over to China to try and get everyone addicted to there, to try and break up the Qing dynasty in China. And by breaking up the Chinese dynasty, they can then go on and colonize China. That's Britain's plan. So they really want a lot of opium. This becomes a really important commodity around this time. And wouldn't you know it, Afghanistan's growing a lot of it. So the British are eyeing it off at this moment. On top of that, Afghanistan has all sorts of other just natural resources. They've got copper and iron and things like that. But it's also part of the historic Silk Road, which of course runs through Central Asia and connects a lot of trade hubs. Afghanistan has always been able to make a lot of money from that. There's also, a lot of Afghan artisans that are world famous for things like their carpets and textiles. And the British think, we wouldn't mind controlling that as well. Why not, right? So this is where Britain is coming into this situation. But there's also one other factor, which is Afghanistan's general geographical position. It lies between India, China, and Russia. And that geological location is going to also be a huge factor in this entire story all the way up to the 2020s. At this point in the story, when Britain's involved, they're mainly worried about the Russian Empire, which is under the Tsars at this time. They're worried that Russia might come down and try and snap up some of India. So Britain is thinking, we wouldn't mind to have a nice little buffer colony between us, and while we're at it, we can steal all the opium and everything else. So that's what leads the British to first become really interested in taking over Afghanistan. So the first Anglo-Afghan War, which starts in 1839 and goes until 1842, will start when the British basically invade Afghanistan and they set up a little puppet government under a guy called Shah Shuja, which I'm pretty sure I've massively mispronounced. I apologize. And basically his job is just to keep Afghanistan in line with British colonial policy and start funneling all the trade routes towards India and towards the British and cut off the Russians from access to Afghanistan and then by extension also from India. The Afghan people do not like this. They don't like this at all. And there is a massive uprising led by a guy called Akbar Khan. Because Afghanistan is already very decentralized and these tribes and they've got the Peshawari spirit, they start guerrilla warfare against the British troops in the territory. They start massacring them. They kill about 17,000 British troops really quickly. And the British basically have to admit defeat. Like, they militarily cannot conquer this place. It is already so decentralized that the usual divide and conquer tactics that the British are using aren't really working here. It's already divided, but these people are united in one thing, which is kicking the British out. And of course, the British will eventually have to take the loss, but they need to save face. But nonetheless, this is the biggest colonial defeat. First time the British have been stopped dead in their colonial tracks. This won't stop Britain from doing all the horrible colonial things they normally do. They're burning down villages, they're imposing famine, the usual tactic they use to try and break people. But you just can't break the will of the Afghan people, as everyone in this story is going to learn. They are very self-sufficient people because they live that life at that low-level tribal village level. It's always bottom up. And they look after each other, and they don't need to rely on international trade. The sanctions don't hurt them like they do other countries. And Britain, although it will commit, all the horrible crimes you usually see in colonial takeovers, they are never able to break these people. But the Afghans do strike a deal because they realize that the British do have a lot of resources and a lot of weapons and a lot of military might, and they could just keep coming back. And although the Afghans are very tough and they're winning, they are still taking a lot of losses, and their home is being devastated by this. So they decide to strike a treaty, and basically what they agree on is that Afghanistan will not become a colony in the British Empire, but the British Empire will be allowed to dictate its foreign policy. As far as the British are concerned, this is a good kind of middle ground in that they get to at least keep Russia out of Afghanistan, and they get to control at least the flow of trade coming out of Afghanistan. Even if they can't outright control what they're producing there, they can't maximize their opium output, for example, but at least they can be the main trader of the opium that is being produced, and, well, it's not a bad consolation prize. And this will work for a little while until about the 1870s when the Afghans start to no longer fear the British. It's been a few years since the war, and for all intents and purposes, they won it. And Russia, Imperial Russia, starts to talk to them and like, we would like to open trade with you. And the Afghans are thinking, yes, we wouldn't mind that either. But the British, of course, object immediately, and they think this is a very, very dangerous precedent to let a semi-colony set its own foreign policy. So Britain invades again to re-establish control. Once again, it does not go well. They face almost the same situation as before, and there is massive uprising against the British troops in the area. However, the British have learnt some lessons, and they know that the new treaty they need to set up needs to start separating these tribes a bit more. And this will be the creation of a thing called the Durand Line in about 1893, where Britain they've been dividing and conquering countries for a while now, and they know some of the tactics that do work. And one of the things they do is they basically just draw an arbitrary line right through the middle of the Pashtun tribes and put half of them within the kind of Indian side of the border, and the other half can stay in Afghanistan. And by doing this, they basically start bribing all of the ones on the Indian side and giving them a lot of money, a lot of support, a lot of internal power in the local area. And by elevating them while pushing down the others, they cause a split between the two tribes. This is a split that it's still going to this day, by the way. Like, the south of the south part of the Pashtun area is now in Pakistan, and the north is still in Afghanistan. This is something that, we've seen Britain do everywhere. They love drawing arbitrary lines on a map to divide people. It's a very effective tactic that they've used, and it's one of the reasons you kind of have heaps of fighting, especially like ethnic fighting in the world today. Again, this is one of the most destabilizing things the British ever did, and they did it for purely cynical reasons, just to destabilize areas so they could steal all the resources, the usual colonial methods. And in the short term, this kind of works. It does actually divide the Pashtun areas, and it does quell a bit of the resistance, but this is still Afghanistan, and they're not going to be oppressed or lorded over for long. And then when World War I breaks out and Britain is utterly exhausted by all of the fighting, they are bankrolling all of World War I on the Allied side. Britain is bankrupt. Their soldiers have been massacred. There is no appetite for war whatsoever. And a lot of British colonial subjects see this as an opportunity to fight for their own independence and their own self-determination. And front of that queue is, of course, Afghanistan. And this will break out into the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919. And this time, Afghanistan is 100% successful. They managed to kick the British out completely. Britain does not have the power to take this place back. And Afghanistan, as far as I'm aware, I think they're the first of the British kind of colonies to actually get their independence via military uprising. They won't be the last, of course, but they're the first. But Britain and, the general Western countries, by this point, they've already come up with a new tactic anyway, because from about the end of the First World War, and especially after the Second World War, everyone knows that colonialism in general is falling out of vogue. It is not seen as a good thing to do to go and occupy some foreign land and say, this belongs to me and belongs to my empire, especially after World War II, of course, because that's what the whole thing was fought over, right? Like, they made a really big deal that this is a war for freedom and independence, especially in Europe. And there's a lot of talk of like liberating countries. That's a huge theme that runs all the way through World War II, which is why it's so jarring after the war that in Europe, everyone's talking about, well, we liberated this country and liberated France and, all of that. And then all the British colonies are going, well, what about us? Like, we want liberation too. Hell, a lot of us even fought for you during the war. Why do we still have to be oppressed under the same governments? We have our own version of Nazi Germany here in the colonies, and it's Britain. It's a British Empire. They're doing to us what the Nazis are doing to everyone in Europe, so we want our freedom as well. Well, they've got a very good point, don't they? And that's something that, especially once the UN is set up, people are talking about this a lot openly. And Britain is sweating bullets through all this because they're going, we're still the biggest colonial country in the world. We have a whole colonial empire built on, you can't even hide the fact that it's subjugation and effectively slavery and just stealing everyone's resources. So in order for colonialism to continue, it kind of has to be rebranded. And this is where you start seeing the rise of neocolonialism in the 1950s. And it's the Americans especially that are really good at this. They realize that you don't necessarily have to go and invade a country. All you have to do is find a way to control its economy. And the capitalists and the CIA and everyone, they come up with this idea. You set up debt traps. You basically go into a country and go, I talk about this a lot, by the way. You probably heard it in the last podcast, but they'll go into a country and just go, okay, you're going to take massive loans from us. And when you default on those loans, which you will, because you'll never be able to pay them back, well, in payment, we're just going to take control of your natural resources until you've paid us off. And in exchange for that, that's a terrible deal. No, everyone can see that's a terrible deal. But the person at the top, there'll be a president or a monarch or whatever. In this case, it's a monarch, by the way, in Afghanistan. And you basically say, look, in exchange for letting us basically steal everything in your country, we're going to protect you politically. You're always going to have the Western military backing up your government. We're going to make you personally fabulously rich. And all you got to do is just let us take all the resources. And if that isn't a good enough deal, well, just know that there's also, that's the carrot. There's also a stick. If you don't accept this deal, we're just going to assassinate you and put someone in power who will take this deal. So you might as well just take it, right? And Afghanistan will fall into this trap like many other colonial countries. And between about the 1920s up until 1970s, it becomes a feudal capitalist economy. So basically the people are living still like, feudal society, but there's all this capitalist development going up. Like, for example, US aid will move in and start building roads throughout Afghanistan. You often hear about the colonial people when they're defending it going, we came in and we built the roads. Except the roads in Afghanistan only go from, the mines and the opium fields and just go straight to the trade hubs and the roads that head to India and then eventually to the ports. None of the roads are actually for development. They're not for the people. They're not helping the people of Afghanistan in any way. They're just there to facilitate and speed up the mineral and resource extraction. As a result of this, the general quality of life of the people in Afghanistan starts to decline. And it's very fortuitous then that something else happens at about the same time. Because by the 1950s, two of Afghanistan's three neighbours, I guess there's four neighbours if you count Iran as well, but two of their northern neighbours, for example, have both become communist countries in that time. You have the very big Soviet Union on one side, and you've got communist China on the other. And their influence is definitely seeping into Afghanistan. And there's a lot of agitprop coming from both countries going in there, going, look, people of Afghanistan, you don't have to live this way. You can embrace socialism. You can fight for your right. You can change all of this. You can kick out the capitalists. You can kick out the US. You can kick out this neo-colonialism. All you got to do is just reach up and take it, right? And this will see the formation of a group called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which goes by the little acronym or initialism, I guess, PDPA. So we're going to be talking about them. So when I say PDPA, that's the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan. And they start to become a big political force in Afghanistan. Eventually, they will build up enough strength to launch the Saur Revolution, which happens in April 1978. And the PDPA overthrows the, basically US-British sponsored puppet government, and the socialists take control. And the PDPA will immediately put into action the usual things you see socialist governments do. They start land distribution to all of the peasants and the workers. They start a mass literacy program. That's really effective, by the way. In less than 10 years, more than 60% of Afghans will have a very high literacy rate. They also bring in huge reforms in women's rights. They ban forced marriage. They promote education. All that sort of stuff. It becomes a very relatively free society under socialism, and the place starts to actually prosper. The standard of living of Afghans starts to increase, and it looks like this is going to be a very successful thing. So you can probably guess that America isn't happy about that, and they decide to do something about it, as they always do. Whenever there's any socialist government that looks like it's actually going to achieve its goals, America has to go in and destroy it, and this will be no different. The remnants of the monarchy that they had been sponsoring are still around, and they're very conservative, and they definitely like to use weaponized Islam in their quest for power, basically setting the most hardest conservative, fundamentalist views of Islam, embraced by the conservatives here because they're great oppression tools, aren't they? And America decides we're going to find these guys and we're going to back them and we're going to fund them and we're going to train them. We're going to turn them into a guerrilla force and we're going to use them to overthrow the PDPA and end this socialist nonsense in Afghanistan once and for all. The group that is being created here by the US and the CIA, they are very famous. They are known as the Mujahideen. And they are going to be a unified force. And they're ironically going to use all of the great things that Afghanistan fighters can do, that Pashtunwali spirit, and they are very unified. And they will start fighting and ambushing and attacking the PDPA everywhere. Meanwhile, the PDPA is very divided, which is unlike leftists, right? They're very, very divided. There's three kind of trains of thought that's going on within the PDPA. The direction they think the country should go. Some people in the group think that Afghanistan should do what it traditionally does and always stay isolationist, always stay neutral, and stay away from all of these other powers, both capitalist and communist. You've got another group in there that thinks we should be heading and aligning ourselves more with the Soviet Union because it's better protection and we can, start building a really strong trade with this very strong partner. There's a third faction that thinks, no, we should start allying with communist China because they're our biggest neighbors. And I think in terms of the kind of general agrarian background of the two countries, we kind of align better with them anyway. So there's the three factions here, and they are not really cooperating on a lot of things. Meanwhile, the Mujahideen are being run with an iron fist, and they are very strong, and they are causing a lot of damage, and it looks like they're going to win. This is what's going to lead to the second invasion of Afghanistan, which is, of course, the Soviet invasion in December 1979. We're taught in the West, we've always been taught that Russia, the Soviet Union just invaded Afghanistan completely unprovoked to, absorb them into the empire and do all the horrible things that, usually America does to countries. That's how it's portrayed to us. But when you start learning about this, you kind of realize it's the opposite, because the Soviet Union is going into Afghanistan to support the actual de facto government, which is the PDPA. So the USSR is going in there to hold up the people's government of the time, and it's America backing the Mujahideen that are trying to overthrow it. But, of course, this is still Afghanistan, and they're not unified on this approach. A lot of people do not like any foreign invaders in their country, regardless of what country they come from, regardless of their ideology. I mean, no country really likes being invaded by anyone, but I think this is especially true from everything I read about Afghanistan. And the people are going to be divided on the Soviet invasion of the country. And so all the factionalism that's happening on the left, you even have some of the people in the PDPA openly defying the USSR intervention. Meanwhile, again, the Mujahideen are united and they are really starting to win. And the Mujahideen will start escalating at the behest of the CIA. The CIA kind of really fund the idea that we should turn this into a holy war, like make this look like it's something that has a lot of legitimacy behind it and it might help unify the cause a little bit more. But of course, this is completely, deeply cynical. It never has anything to do with Islam at all. This is always about capitalist control of the country. Nonetheless, the CIA will send like $3 billion to the Mujahideen to fund them, give them weapons, give them support, send trainers. There are CIA officers all over the place helping them get intelligence and just getting them organized. None of this is speculation, by the way. You can go and look all of this up. It's called Operation Cyclone. The CIA freely admit it. They love this stuff. Anyway, fun side note, one of the biggest agents that'll operate in Afghanistan that is being supported and in fact was recruited by the CIA is a little guy whose name you might have heard before. Is Osama bin Laden, and he'll be one of the biggest US assets in Afghanistan. Anyway, after enough time, the Mujahideen start to get a lot of momentum, especially as other countries around Afghanistan very opportunistic countries realize that maybe we should throw our lot in with them too, because we're aligned with the US and this could end up being in our benefit long term. So a lot of other countries start backing the Mujahideen along with the US, including Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And the PDPA will start making some fatal errors here, because as the violence and the war starts to escalate, they turn away from what has traditionally made them so strong, which is the decentralized organization of the tribes in the country. And they have instead been trying to consolidate power and basically backing the Soviet troops to centralize the power around them. But of course, as foreign invaders, that isn't sitting well with most of the tribes. And this whole thing just starts to fall apart. The PDPA does not have the organization it needs to beat the Mujahideen, which at this point is becoming very organized. And from this point on, it all just starts to collapse. And by 1989, the Soviets are gone, the PDPA is collapsing, and the Mujahideen are now firmly in charge. And they will then rebrand as another group, which of course we are all we know very well. They're called the Taliban. So by this point, the US has basically won. They've got a new neo-colonial colony set up. Job done, we can all go home. But of course, this is Afghanistan. And they do not like being ruled by anyone. If we haven't learned anything else in this story so far, we definitely know that. And they stop cooperating with the US once they win. The Taliban does its own thing. It just stops cooperating with US foreign policy, which at the time the US finds very annoying, but it's not that much of a big deal. They're thinking, whatever, we'll take care of this when it becomes a serious issue. But then opportunism comes, of course, and in 2001, the war on terror begins after 9/11. I am definitely not going to deep dive on 9/11 in this podcast, because if we do that, we're going to be here all day, aren't we? So let's just skip straight to the war on terror. What is that all about anyway? That this is very important and pertinent to this story. Remember that the main objective in Central Asia and West Asia has always been taking out Iran, which is the country that America has the most beef with, because again, America used to have Iran as a cooperative colony, but they had their own revolution and they took over their own affairs, and America wasn't able to stop it, and they lost all of that oil, and they've been very, very bitter about it ever since. They're still bitter about it to this day, and that has always been the dream, to take down Iran. But they're thinking, before we do that, let's clean up house a little bit, because we've got uncooperative puppets in both Iraq and Afghanistan, which of course border Iran on either side of it. You've got Iraq in the west and Afghanistan in the northeast. And they're thinking, we've got two puppet governments here, and they're both not really cooperating. Saddam isn't cooperating in Iraq, and the Taliban aren't cooperating in Afghanistan. So let's invade both of them, get the house in order on both sides, and then, we basically have the entire border of Iran surrounded by US military bases. This is going to make that war a hell of a lot easier. And I think that was ultimately the goal of the war on terror. What they didn't expect is that they were going to be bogged down in the wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq for 20 years. But they should have known that, because that's been the story so far. There is a reason Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires. But the Americans aren't completely foolish on this topic. They have learnt something from the past, and one of the things they know is that you do need to get control of the tribal elders in order to stop mass resistance against your troops. The problem is they don't quite learn the right lesson about that, because America will go in and it basically just starts to go into these communities and go, okay, who's someone who will cooperate with us? All right, we're going to elevate you to become leader or warlord or whatever in this area, and then you can do our bidding. We'll give you all the money and support, and then you will do our bidding. The problem is, as we remember from the Pashtunwali spirit, the Afghans really, really don't like outside people telling them who's in charge and telling them what to do. So a lot of these leaders that America picks are not respected or followed by the people who are supposed to be respecting and following them. And the Taliban, even though the Taliban at this point has kind of been in decline, like people are not really feeling them all that much once there's peacetime happening in Afghanistan, as it had been for years at this point. But because the US have invaded and because they're trying to destabilize the whole country, people start rallying behind the Taliban. For one thing, they're organized, they actually understand how America works, they were trained by them after all, and they know US tactics, they know how to use US weapons, they know how to organize, and they start insurgency campaign against the US occupation. But one of the biggest reasons America can't actually win this war is because they don't want to. One of the reasons they went in there in the first place is because they just want to give them, the US military industrial complex things to spend money on. That's the whole point of the military industrial complex, is to make money and to make weapons and to make war. When you win a war, you have to stop that. You have to demobilize the war economy, and America doesn't want that. It wants to keep this gravy train going. So America, the people at the top really want this to be a forever war. And I've talked at length before in other videos and things as well, that how you decide who's going to win a war is basically who's most organized. Hell, we just saw that with the PDPA and the Taliban, the Mujahideen, sorry. The fact that the Mujahideen were more organized than the PDPA is ultimately why they won. And I don't just mean militarily or logistically, I also mean politically, diplomatically. If you've got a good plan and you can get your people to stick to it, you can ultimately win. It's the same reason the North Vietnamese were able to beat America in the Vietnam War. And the same thing's going to happen here. The Taliban have always been very organized and very patient, and they know how to fight the war. They know the tactics, they know the strategy. But America didn't come here to win. America came here to make money. They came to steal all of the basically opium and resources. And there's this other really interesting dynamic that happened, is because one of the architects for the war on terror and the invasion of Afghanistan in the first place is then Vice President Dick Cheney, who owns a company called Halliburton. And Halliburton and another company called Blackwater are basically in charge of rebuilding the areas that are devastated by US bombing and US war. How much of a conflict of interest is that, by the way? Like, it's the person who's starting the wars is also going to be in charge of making the most money from the reconstruction of those wars. Yikes. Anyway, that's one of the reasons America can't win this, is because they don't want to win. They want this war to keep going. They want the devastation to happen. They want to keep bombing things. And they want the contracts to rebuild them, because every time they get a contract to rebuild it, they can inflate the price, and wouldn't you know it, over time, billions of dollars are just disappearing, completely unaccounted for. No one knows where they go. From that moment on, until this day, the Pentagon hasn't passed an audit of where the money it's spending is going, because all of it is just being, embezzled by people at the top. What is really happening in Afghanistan on the US side is a heist. They're using it to steal not just everything, of value in Afghanistan, but also steal all the US taxpayer money. And that level of corruption versus the discipline and organization and patience that the Taliban has is why America cannot win this war, and ultimately doesn't. Even though this goes for 20 years, America will never make any progress. Now, the US troops on the ground, of course, are doing their best in their colonial endeavors and imperialist endeavors. They're doing their best, but what can they possibly do when the people at the very top of their military and government are sabotaging them at every step? It's an absolute nightmare for the US troops on the ground, and of course, they're going to lose. And that pretty much brings us to the modern day. So that was the very, very quick speed run Triploy version of the Afghan history. But I guess the question now is, what's going to become of Afghanistan now that the Taliban have firmly taken over? And it is worth noting that they were losing a lot of popularity before the US invasion. And when you have a really authoritarian government, which is what the Taliban is, it really only works when things are going badly. Like if you're being invaded, or you have really bad hardships, you need kind of authoritarian figures to guide the country through the hard times. But when the wars end, you kind of find that the authoritarian and often fascist governments don't have much to do, and they lose their popularity quickly. I think one of the most famous examples of that is what happened to Franco in Spain after the Spanish Civil War. He managed to hold on to power all the way through World War II because the threat of that was always there. But look how quickly Franco's fascist government starts to lose power in the years after the Second World War. And I'm wondering if something similar will happen to the Taliban here. It's also really hard to gauge where all of the socialist sympathies in Afghanistan have gone. I know a lot of people in Afghanistan would have hidden those sympathies in light of everything that was going on and, in the unified effort to kick the US out of the country. And I'm wondering if they're going to go back and look at the mistakes of the Saur Revolution and the mistakes of the PDPA, and maybe they might rehabilitate some of those ideas and bring them back. I mean, communist China is still their neighbor, and I'm sure they're still influencing them. There's, of course, a lot of underground resistance in Afghanistan. I'm pretty sure the women's underground resistance is still strong. There's still a big call for worker rights and worker reforms. So who really knows what's going to happen in Afghanistan in the years to come? All we know is that the Taliban have won, and at the point of this podcast, they are firmly in control of the country and are, for all intents and purposes, the de facto government. What that's going to turn into, I don't know, but one thing I am sure of is no one else is going to invade Afghanistan anytime soon. Or at least they shouldn't, because you really need to learn this history. And if there's one thing we have thoroughly learned from all of this research and this podcast, it's that you cannot control Afghanistan. They do not want to be ruled by anyone, and it is folly, absolute folly, people, to even attempt it. But I guess I would like to end this podcast on a more positive note, though. And I want to end it by something I saw. I once saw this picture. Apparently it's from Kabul in 2022, and it's just a picture of some graffiti that's on a wall of a building. And this is what it's allegedly translated to, but I love this message because it's so hopeful, and it really does set up where I think the future of Afghanistan is going, because I do think these are people who have freedom in their soul. It is one of the reasons they've been decentralized for such a long time, and probably always will be. But anyway, the graffiti says, translated into English, it says, "They've tried kings, communists, and jihadis. Next is workers' power." And I just love that. I think that's great. Anyway, thank you for tuning in for episode 2 of the Triplo podcast. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed making it. If you're enjoying these podcasts and you want to kind of support the show, please check out the Patreon, patreon.com/Triploy, and just become a member, become a free member, so you always get notified when they're coming out. And of course, all of these podcasts are available anywhere you'll find podcasts, but I suppose there's not much point telling you that here because you're already listening to it. But anyway, thank you. Share this with a friend if you think they would enjoy it. Otherwise, thank you for joining me, and hopefully this has given you something to think about.